Hey, everybody. My guest today has a compelling story that I think many of us can appreciate and learn from. Craig Robinson is a successful business executive, mainly in the corporate real estate world, and at one time held the title of president at one of the largest brokerage firms in the world. He attended MIT and later Harvard for his MBA. And by every traditional metric, Craig has been a success climbing the corporate ladder. Then he decided to pause and pursue happiness. Instead of seeking identity and validation through traditional corporate titles, Craig started coaching others on how to find fulfillment in their careers, their relationships, and their faith. As a result, he's written a book about happiness and what it means to invest in ourselves and to invest in others. He's a leader at heart, and it shows throughout this conversation. So open up your mind about the idea of finding happiness as we sit down with Craig Robinson. We'll rock and roll. So joining from Atlanta, and I believe, I mean, you've moved around a bit, but Atlanta is the home base and where it all started, right?
Born and raised, man. This is where the story began, and maybe this is where it ends. But Atlanta now.
Yeah, Atlanta's home. And talk to me about that, about the influences you had, because I do want to talk about your corporate career and you know what led you to the place you're at now and the book you're writing. But what's the foundation for you and your family and how it all got started?
Yeah, great question. And the answer to that has a lot to do with why I returned to Atlanta. Post COVID, I had been in New York for 12 years, really prior, working, thriving, doing what a lot of people do when they go to cities like New York. And I think the world slowed down just long enough and just slow enough for people to reflect on where you really need to be healthy physically, emotionally, psychologically, and returning home to a place that I know, a community that I know, close to family. Oh yeah, birds, trees, clean
Yeah.
sidewalk, all those things. But you know, my family has been in Georgia for literally hundreds of years pre-emancipation, and so there's a lot of history here in the state of Georgia. My family's what we call old Atlanta.
Mm.
We've been in and around the city, so when I move around the city, I can look and experience many generations of my people who've been here, who've been a part of building it. We were early real estate home builders and developers. We were very early on involved in higher ed, and so there's just a lot of pride that I have in terms of my family's origin here in Atlanta, and so I'm living in the city in Old Fourth Ward, which is a community that's going through a lot of change, a lot of transformation, and it's a lot of exciting things. So, but yeah, come on down here and visit us, man. This is the capital of the South.
Yeah, I have a good buddy that lives there, and been there a few times to visit him. And it's a great city, you know. And there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy there. So as you were growing up, what were your influences, or who were your influences as a kid?
Yeah. Well, for people who are not as familiar with Atlanta, it's probably worth just saying this. Atlanta has had a very large African American population. It's been a big part of the fabric of the culture, of the politics. It's had African American mayors since 1972. And at the exact same time as being a top five city in terms of Fortune 500 companies based here. So I grew up having you know lived and gone to school where Martin Luther King lived and grew up. My grandmother went to school with Martin Luther
Mm.
King. I grew up having the opportunity to see African American politicians, doctors, lawyers, faith leaders, middle class in a very visible way. And that had a huge and profound impact on my sense of self and my sense of what was possible. Even if my own personal immediate household was more fragile economically and otherwise, it was actually a pretty tough environment for me growing up. I didn't grow up in the best of neighborhoods. My household had a lot of turbulence. My father left when I was young, but there was still this sense of what's possible. And although my mom didn't have a whole lot, she really pushed us in school. And you know, I think the sheer sense of what was possible was visible, even if it wasn't always accessible directly. And that gave me a sense of what was possible. So I went to a public high school, Greg, and was in a magnet program that was for math and science. And I'll never forget, I had a calculus teacher who said, Craig, I want you to go down to the cafeteria. There's a school there you should meet. And it was MIT. I had never heard of MIT. I didn't
Hmm.
know what it was. But I went down to our cafeteria and there was a recruiter from MIT. Lo and behold, a few months later, I'm packing my bags and heading to Cambridge. But I would have to discredit the fact that I grew up in the city with people who cared enough about me, and there was enough signs of success that made me feel like I could do it.
That's awesome. Yeah, those teachers, those coaches along the way, you know, sometimes they don't even realize the impact they have on our lives, right? And the
Huge.
directions they can shoot us, and that's a perfect example.
Yeah. No, that's I listen, there are kids who are more fortunate in terms of going to private schools and having lots of money and lots of resources. We didn't have those things, but whatever we lack in those resources, we made up for in love. We made up for in just pouring encouragement, positive. I never had a teacher tell me anything other than, and I could be what I wanted to be, and I believed it. I think
Yeah,
we all believe it. My high school, which is an Atlanta Public Schools inside the perimeter, we had people who went to military academies, who went to Ivy Leagues, who went to HBCUs, and we were probably hitting above our weight class, but only because we had teachers and people who really cared and poured into us. And I think that's no different today. I think even as we find ourselves in tough times, I do believe in the power and the magic of a person speaking positive energy and potential into a child. They'll hear it, they'll receive it. It's a seed that's planted, and it will eventually grow.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree with that. Um, Now, I heard you say that your great 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 grandfather was born into slavery
Yeah,
and then became a free man. And you grew up in the South. I didn't. Maybe that's more common among your peers to have that history, but for those that aren't from the South,
sure.
how does that resonate with you today and growing up in the discussions at home?
Great question. Listen, this country is still wrestling with its past, and some of us don't have the luxury to forget about it and be dismissive. In fact, some of us have to look to that history and draw strength from it. My great 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 grandfather, George Washington Golson, was born in 1860 in Doraville, which is just 45 minutes from where I live today. And his father was his enslaver, and his mother, Adeline Liddell, was on a neighboring plantation. And I've been able to trace my family in Georgia back to the 1700s. So it's a parenthetical when people talk about who is American, who belongs here, that type of stuff. It's an
Mhm.
interesting thing when you like, hey, we've been here for a really, really, really long time, pouring into this land and pouring into the soil. But that said, I have a good sense for just who my family was, where they lived. Um, but where the point of pride is for me is one, first and foremost, in surviving that. But then my great great grandfather, who was born enslaved, went on to be a farmer, a commercial farmer, where he was able to build a business where he was trading. And with that, he built a church that's still standing today. And with that, he also built a school, and he went on to serve as a trustee of Morris Brown, which was one of the early HBCUs. And then his kids went on to really continue that tradition. And so I just have so much pride at a point in time when people weren't even considered human or 100% human, certainly didn't have the rights of humanity
Mhm.
to be able to build a business, to be able to accumulate land, to be able to do things without banks and loans and that type of stuff. So I show up with an extreme sense of appreciation and awareness for that history, for that past, and what it means for me. And I would not know whether or not that's easy or hard for others to do, but I would think it's worth the effort to try to go back and find your history wherever it is. Maybe your history takes you overseas, but for me, it was here in Georgia going back a few hundred years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that I appreciate you sharing that and encouraging people to understand their history and the impacts of that. So the math teacher has you go talk to the person at MIT. Obviously, you must have been excelling at school. And so were you good at school? Were you, because you do MIT, you do Harvard Business School later. I mean, you had to be some kind of decent student to get that kind of attention.
Greg, people love to tell their stories in a way where it starts from the bottom and it goes up to the
Mm,
upper right corner and it's fairly linear, predictable. Or even if they're really excited about themselves, they tell this exponential, like there's this point where I just really took off. My life is a scatter plot. Um, and I can kind of go back and force a line through it. But the truth of the matter, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of space in between these moments where it was anything but clear. If you were to go back just a few years prior to me having a calculus teacher who suggested that I go talk to MIT, I was probably a fairly typical troubled middle schooler. I wasn't doing great in school. I got into fights. I had a lot of anger, from what was happening in my household. I was exposed to drugs and lots of things that would have made me fairly typical in terms of um, what kids in the environment that I grew up were exposed to. And it was not clear to me that my life was going to be anything other than what I was experiencing. But there was a teacher, and I don't even know who that teacher was in middle school, who said, Craig has potential. Why don't we move him into this other group? And I don't, I can't even tell you what conversation was had with my mom, but someone said, put him in this other group. And there was this group where, let's just call them the nerdy kids.
yeah,
And they were playing board games or reading comic books. And there's something about being around that new environment, just a different classroom that changed everything for me. Literally, like one teacher saying, move them from this group to this group. And Greg, it changed everything for me. I went from fighting and getting into trouble to being competitive and being into books. And this was seventh and eighth grade, ninth grade to 12th grade. I made straight A's straight. I
mm,
made one B and I was in trigonometry and was one grade shy of being valedictorian of my class. But in seventh grade and eighth grade, you would have not been betting on me. You would have been saying, this kid is going to be in trouble. He's going to, maybe he'll make it. And, but not only did I make it, I ended up doing really well to your point. I was SGA president, graduated top of my class. And although I didn't have a lot of people coaching me on college. I just didn't have a lot of that immediately in my family. I applied to any college that gave me a fee waiver. I visited any school, which was only two, Coast Guard Academy and MIT, that paid for me to come visit because we didn't have money. So I
hmm
visited. And I got into every school I applied and ultimately decided to go to MIT. But I would just say that there's nature and there's nurture. Maybe there was some nature that was in there that just needed to be activated. But the nurture was undoubtedly important. Had certain teachers not advocated for me, pushed me, nudged me, exposed me to certain things, Greg, I would be lying to tell you that I'm some superstar who was going to get there regardless. I'm not.
yeah.
And if I told you a story of my past that made it look that way, I'd be being a liar, I'd be disingenuous. And I certainly would not be honoring the people who did a little bit more than they needed to.
Yeah. Well, there's so much in there. I mean, I think how impressionable we are, particularly as kids, in our own identity, right? If you can help a kid understand, like, actually, you have the potential to be this, and they start looking at themselves. Like, you started looking at yourself as, well, maybe I am a good student, maybe there is this path for me. And without that exposure, you don't even believe that yourself, right? And so the influence of, and I've talked about it on the podcast, the influence of coaches and teachers are so profound. I can remember distinct conversations with coaches in particular that changed my mindset and led
Mm,
me on a different path where it led me to believe in myself, and then good
yep.
things came from that. And I think your story really resonates with that.
Yeah. It's a timeless story, Greg. It's a story that resonates with wherever, home you grew up, whatever part of the country, whatever part of the world, whatever generation. I think that's a timeless story. And it's a little bit of the story of Homo sapiens in terms of how we how we evolve and advance. Each has to invest and sacrifice a little bit of their life to ensure that the next generation does a little bit better. Um, I would also say, my brother, I have a younger brother who grew up in the exact same household, and we are very, very similar in a lot of ways. But my brother um, is an artist and had the conviction to pursue paths that were less clear and less obvious. And so, and today he's a very successful professional artist. Whereas I kind of went the academic route and the business route. My brother went the artistic route, and so it reminds me that you can nurture two seeds, but
Mm,
not know what is going to grow. But both plants in healthy soil can produce something really, really beautiful, and they don't have to be the same. And I would say one of the things that my mom was smart to recognize was my brother and I were different. And so goodness can look different. You don't need to
right.
goodness be, formulaic. Goodness is whatever someone's potential, whatever their passion is, really nurturing and encouraging that. She could have said, "Hey, why don't you be an engineer? Why don't you get into technology? Why don't you do that?" And that would have really been crushing for him, and it would have missed the opportunity for him to really flourish in the passions, but also his talents. And I think likewise, when I think about how do you encourage kids, it's not encouraging them to be what you want them to be, it's
Mm.
encouraging them to be what they can be and what they want to be, and just giving them the guardrails and the support to do that. Um, and I do have some points of view around where I think we've maybe gotten a little bit off track in the country in terms of how we encourage our kids, but by and large, I think that my mom had it right on that one.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I mean, and noticing the difference in each of you, and allowing that to grow. You go the academic route, the Harvard Business School route, and you kind of get on the corporate ladder, right? And you ended up in the real estate sector. That's how we know each other. And so, what
Yeah.
drew you into the real estate side of business?
Yeah. This is another plot moment because I was not thinking, I didn't even realize commercial real estate as an industry
Mm,
existed. I never really thought about it. I wasn't conscious of it. When I graduated from MIT, I worked for Arthur Anderson doing consulting. And I actually spent a year working in Europe implementing ERP and doing technology kind of consulting type stuff. And it was a very typical good out of college job. You don't know what you want to do. You don't know who you want to be. And to be honest, you're just kind of going with the herd a little bit, which is you generally kind of get one of these, kind of broad post college kind of starting careers. But I started to notice something when I came back to Atlanta. As I mentioned, I didn't grow up in the best part of Atlanta. Atlanta's a great city, but it has its pockets. And I grew up in one of those pockets that wasn't so great. And I remember thinking, wow, I've seen some really cool stuff. I'd love to figure out how to be a part of transforming and, creating opportunities in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. And it got me thinking about words like urban renewal before I knew what urban renewal, economic development before I knew what economic
mm,
development. And I just started having coffees with people who did that type of stuff, people at the Atlanta Development Authority, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And real estate kept coming up. Real estate kept coming up. And I was like, oh, this thing is real estate. Had no idea. I tried hard, Greg. I would ask anybody in real estate to have a coffee with me, just meet with me. And it was a tough industry to get into. And ultimately, I'll tell you, I decided to go to business school because I thought it would help me recast myself and improve my chances of getting into this industry because it was really hard. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have anyone sponsor me, advocate for me. And it was kind of a little bit of a hustle. But in the process of going back to B school, I was interviewing for a scholarship. And one of the interviewers of the scholarship was the then head of real estate for Coca Cola. And I was telling him about all of my grand visions of what I want to do in real estate. He says, all right, well, I'm going to help you out. And this is not on my resume, it's not in my bio, but I'll tell the story because, again, it just speaks to the power of people doing things for you
mm,
that they don't have to. So this person said, hey, there's this brokerage firm that wants to do work for me. I'm going to reach out to them and ask them if they'll allow you to intern just for free. Effectively,
mhm,
you did that back in the '90s. You could do stuff for free, um, and they did because they wanted to do work and business with this person. And they said, sure, we'll have them. So I went and saved up all of my vacation that I had with Arthur Anderson and went and worked for this brokerage firm in New York. I had never been to New York. I slept on the sofa of my buddy who lived in Brooklyn, and I was basically kind of a brokerage support.
Yeah.
Basically was, and that was my first foray into real estate. But of course, at that summer ended, I went back to Arthur Anderson, finished up, and went to Harvard. And when I graduated, I came out, worked for Trammell Crow. And I'm almost certain that because Trammell Crow saw that I had worked for this brokerage firm, they said, this guy is serious about this and we're going to give him a shot. And the rest is history, Greg. But I would be lying if I told you that had it not been for someone saying, hey, give this guy a chance to just be an intern
Hmm.
for free. Like, just let him come in and watch what you guys do. And this was in the old days where the brokers that I work with would just say, Craig, take a steno pad. I want you to walk out to the buildings and tell me what you see. I want you to walk into the lobby and tell me what tenants are in the. It was really basic stuff,
Sure.
kind of before CoStar. But that's how I started. That's how I started.
I think a key part in that story, Craig, is this person wanted to help you out. That's another example of people helping out, young people that are have a good attitude, but also you helped create that opportunity. You weren't
Mhm.
just waiting for the phone to ring. You said you were out there having coffees with people, meeting
Yeah,
with people. And I do think that's important. We
it is.
talk about it on this podcast about paying your dues. And part of it is you got to put in the legwork
You
when you
do.
don't know what the outcome's going to be. And you were
That's right.
out there, and that's still relevant today. I mean, I talk to people
Yes,
that want to get into commercial real estate, and I tell them, you got to go talk to people. You got to, and it's not even that industry. I mean, it's any industry. But I think being out there, and generally people want to help others,
I
especially if
think that.
you're putting in the effort. And I
Yeah,
think, uh, part of that opportunity came from that legwork you were doing.
I think so. Listen, I tell people you could be a rock at the bottom of the ocean and absorb no water, or you could be a sponge in the desert and absorb whatever moisture
Mm,
there is. I'd rather be the sponge in the desert any day.
mm,
And you have to ask yourself, am I a rock who's been exposed to everything, given everything, and do nothing with it? Or am I that sponge that will absorb any opportunity? Just I'm waiting for the breeze to come through. I tell folks that I believe that there are 4 seasons in your career, and each season is defined and marked by different challenges, different opportunities, different ways of thinking about what it means. um, so the first season is getting into the game. You're a sports person, so you'll appreciate the metaphor.
mhm,
How do I get into the game, whether it's investment banking or consulting or real estate or technology? And so much of that has to do with your desire, your chutzpah, your willingness to kind of keep trying and knocking at the door, knocking on different doors, asking someone to help you knock. But that in of itself is is actually one of the most difficult things. And sometimes it requires sponsors. Sometimes it requires someone doing exactly what they did for me, which is like, you're knocking, but you're not knocking loud enough. Let me knock for you.
mhm,
But once you get in the game, and we know this from our industry, commercial real estate, if it's hard to stay in it, particularly if you're in a performance-based role where performance largely comes from, mastering the skill, accessing networks, accessing, customers and deals and whatnot. And to the degree that you have all of the capability, but you're missing some of those things that you may not be aware of that are necessary to stay in the game, building relationships, mentorships, access to social networks, the churn can be pretty high. In fact, some high performance organizations almost are predicated upon the assumption of churn. Like
mhm,
it's a new election to get to the top of the pyramid. Less than 10% will make partner or MD or whatever. But then once you've made it into the game, you've managed to stay in the game. The question is then, how do you win the game? How do you drive greater, income for yourself, greater responsibility, greater impact, bigger seat at the table, however you define winning. And I really do think that should be idiosyncratic. I think you have to define what winning looks like. But generally speaking, your goal should be to grow and to grow up and grow out. And so winning then comes from, I think, those moments in your career where you take chances and you are willing to bet on yourself or bet on an opportunity or be in a situation where you're stretched or advocate for a new product or advocate for a new venture, but some way winning generally comes with taking a risk.
Hmm.
You've had people advocating for you, you've had situations open up for you, but now you need to advocate for yourself, advocate for a point of view. And that's where you start to see kind of the leapfrog in most people's career. And then the last thing, Greg, is the season where I think so much of what you're doing with this podcast is speaking to people when they're in a season where they're trying to change the game.
Hmm.
Change the game is when you now have the ability to reflect and say, how can I help someone else get in? How can I change this game in a way where it's more equitable, more level playing field, where it speaks to the unmet needs in the marketplace, whatever changing means. That is very much kind of a personal, like, what is your raison d'etre? But getting in the game, staying in the game, winning the game, and then changing the game. That's ultimately where true fulfillment comes, is when you have a chance to fulfill, really make a difference and change. And that's really the season that I'm in now. Um, and that is to be what somebody was for me, you know, decades ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah. And the leadership side of your personality, your career, I mean, it just comes out in you, Craig. And so as you got into real estate and the corporate world, I should say, you went the leadership route. What drew that to you? You seem like a natural for it, but you went that direction with your corporate career.
Yeah. Well, I thought I wanted to be a developer. That was the cool, sexy
Yeah.
stuff, right? I wanted to build buildings
Yeah.
and, go back and transform these neighborhoods. And when I came out of business school, um, most people coming out of B school, wanted to be principals, investors, doing high stakes deals and that type of thing. And I came out and worked for Trammell Crow, because they offered me a rotation. They said, "Hey, we're going to allow you to do a little bit of brokerage, a little bit of property management." But I was waiting for and listening to for the development and some development. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, good, I'll do it. And so I almost was not really paying much attention to the investment sales and the leasing. I was just kind of waiting for the part of the rotation where I got a chance to do the development stuff. But then there was one last stop on my rotation, in this thing called corporate services, and I hadn't heard of it and didn't know what it meant. But they asked me, they said, "Hey, would you be willing to try this out?" And what is this? Well, sales and marketing, and that doesn't sound like I'm moving towards being a big real estate developer. Um, but a few things happened, Greg. I ended up loving it, and I didn't know that I was going to love it, and I ended up being good at it. Sales, marketing, strategy, building relationships, thinking through complex issues that corporations were trying to solve with their real estate, and it gave me the lifestyle I actually wanted. And I actually ended up doing development a few years later to give me a comparison with that. And the truth of the matter is, after a few years of doing development, I went back into corporate services because I realized that there are three things that you need to decide and be honest with yourself if you're going to be in your flow. You've got to figure out, number one, what is it you're really good at? And it's hard for people to be honest about that because they want to be good at something that seems like they're going to make a lot of money or you're going to be admired by people. I was really good at with people. I was good with teams. I was really good with, sales and marketing. Then what is it that you really, really enjoy? What gives you passion, Greg? What is it that lights your fire? There's lots of things you can do, but if it doesn't like give you passion, then that's really expensive fuel, and that extra fuel on the last mile is the least crowded. And so that's really where you want that fuel. And then the last is, what is it that gives you the lifestyle you want? Work life balance,
Right.
risk reward. And I started to find that when I had an opportunity to lead teams, lead initiatives, and was moving towards leadership type stuff, I was becoming more and more in my jail, which is what I call it. What am I good at? What am I excited about? What gives me the lifestyle I want? It was more my flow. And this is where opportunity and timing, or luck. But the industry was going through a lot of consolidation, Greg, at a time where, small companies were gobbling up other small companies or merging with them and becoming regional and national. And I was doing what I did really well at a point in time where companies needed people to do more of that work at scale. And so I had an opportunity to be a division president, division CEO at a company, Cassidy Turley.
Hmm.
which is now Cushman and Wakefield, running all of their corporate services. What they wanted was someone to run that division who had been in sales and marketing and could go and grow. And so that was my first time leading a national business, and I loved it, Greg. I was like, I don't know why I didn't just start here, because I really love people. I love developing talent. I love creating, and we were a challenger brand. That was the other thing.
Hmm.
I love finding companies and businesses that were trying to do something different. They were challenging the status quo. And so after doing that 4 or 5 years, we sold the company to TPG. I had an opportunity to go work with our old company, Colliers,
Hmm.
which wanted a very similar person to run their US region, which at the time was about 6,000 professionals and about a billion in total revenue. And I'd never run anything that big, Greg. When you met me, I was still 38 years old,
Hmm.
maybe 39, and I had only run this small business, but I was doing what was in my jail. I was really focused on how do we grow this business, how do we recruit, how do we do M&A, and those things came really naturally for me. But I think, Greg, had I been spending time trying to go do the thing that I thought was sexy, trying to go do the thing that I thought was going to make me a lot of money, I would have missed out on the opportunity to really lean into what I really, really, really enjoyed and what the marketplace needed, was willing to compensate me for. And so I had a chance to run the US region for Colliers, which right during their IPO, you can't plan that. Like
Yeah.
I couldn't have known that. And then, really since then, Greg, I've continued to do those type of roles in other environments. Now moving a little bit more on the technology and innovation side, but I love leadership. I love it. And, I would encourage people to pay attention to those three things. What is it you're good at? What is it that excites you and motivates you? And what is the lifestyle you want? And whatever that is, whether it's leading something, whether it's being a broker, or managing a team, or managing a product, you're going to be in your flow. And if you're in your flow, the opportunities will come to you. Or when the opportunities will come to you, you'll be ready for them because you'll be doing the thing that you're supposed to do, that the creator put you here to do. And I believe that. But you've got to listen out to that, jail.
Yeah. That's there's so much good stuff in there. And you get on this corporate trajectory, and I mean the Collier's job alone. I mean, $1 billion in annual revenue. 6,000 people, and you're in your late 30s. I mean that's a big role, and you continue to hold those roles for a number of years, and then by every metric, I mean, you're a corporate superstar, right? You're working at these high profile jobs and companies, CEO, and you choose to what looks like take a step back, step off the treadmill, and pause and do something different. And that's really exciting and what I appreciate about you. And I want to talk about that. What led you to that decision to say, as much as I love doing this, there's something else I want to do with this skill set?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. It has a lot to do with the philosophy that I embrace these days, which is, pursuing a life that centers around your joy, your happiness. It turns out that fulfillment, and I'm coming back to your question, but fulfillment
Hmm.
comes from focusing on three things. And this is what the research shows. Fulfillment comes from focusing on uh, your purpose. What is it that gives you purpose? What gives you meaning, belonging, the community, the connection, the people that you do it with? And number three, being stretched. And I started to think a lot about what brought me joy and what brought me fulfillment. And while I love building and running and being a part of these businesses, I wanted a portfolio life. I wanted a portfolio career, that gave me more balance and that gave me an opportunity to do certain things at scale. And I love doing what I do, but if I could help other leaders do what I have done, coach CEOs, work as an advisor, serve on corporate boards, it gave me an opportunity to do a few things. One, it allowed me to help others. Two, it allowed me to have impact at scale. And three, it gave me an opportunity to have the life and the balance and the joy that I wanted on a day to day basis. To be clear, being an executive in these environments can be pretty tough,
Hmm.
and it can take a toll on you. And that's totally fine if you want to do that, definitely. And I just started to feel that there are ways that I could get some of what I loved about that job, but do it differently. And I'll tell you why that sounds easy, but is not easy. The reason why it's not easy is because you will have everyone who thinks that you should keep doing what you're doing. Why it's working, why would you change? Why would you change what's working for you? Because they're solving for what looks good, what sounds good. They're solving for their happiness, not yours. And so, big part of what changing up your life and your priorities in a way that may be inconsistent with others is, what I call having courage. You can't crowdsource happiness. And the other thing too is realizing that your purpose may can look real to be fulfilled in lots of different ways. And so I really feel like I'm in my purpose right now. So today I serve on a few corporate boards. I advise investors, private equity fund. I teach a class at Emory. I'm writing a book. And when I wake up every single day, there's so many parts of my brain that are lighting up. And I feel really, really joyful and really grateful that I can, spend my time in a way that feels authentic and feels meaningful and brings me joy. And that may change, Greg. This time next year, I might decide to do something different, but it will be on my terms. It will be according to, my truth, my authenticity, and what brings me joy.
Well, I also think you did it at a point in your life. I mean, you're still young, you know. You didn't make this choice at 65 or 70, right? I
Right.
mean, we don't know how much time we have, right? And
Right.
you did this at a point, and you didn't retire. You
Nope.
just pivoted, right? And so you did it while you still have a lot to give, right? So you're channeling those resources in another
That's right.
way. And I think people sometimes think they have to stay on the hamster wheel, and everyone has a different
Right.
career path. But I think you're a good example of saying, well, wait a minute, it's okay if I want to pivot here for my reasons, and
That's
build
right.
something new out of this.
Yeah. There's a lot of research around happiness, and a lot of it is alarming. People generally have most of their needs met. Most people are doing pretty well in terms of kind of the basic Maslow's, first order of needs type stuff. But when you get into that higher level of like self actualization and you start thinking about deep down inside, am I really happy? I'm making money, I'm
Mhm.
crushing it, I'm doing big deals, I'm doing all these amazing things, I'm getting lots of data boys from my peer group, but am I truly happy? And this is a point where I think many people come to. Some people will blow right past those flags and just say, you know what, I put my head down, keep cranking, keep doing the thing that's worked. um, and there's this concept I call the IRR of happiness. The assumption is that at the end of the cash flows, at the end, there'll be this big residual
Right.
value of happiness in retirement. I'll start focusing on my health once I get through, this next few years. I'll focus on mending my relationship once the kids are out the house. I'll focus on doing something that I enjoy doing once I've made enough money. But the assumption is that you will be around for that. The assumption is that that will happen. And I am a big proponent of bringing that happiness forward.
Mhm.
Don't make the mistake of assuming that you'll have this residual value, that you'll have the time, that you'll have the health, that you have the resources, or even that bundle of goods that you're expecting you'll have will bring you happiness.
Right.
Really start to interrogate that happiness now. And the more I talk about this, Greg, the more I realize that in safe space, people are willing to say, you know what, I'm not exactly as fulfilled as I'd like to be. And I won't tell them that I have the answer for that, but I'll tell them to sit with it and to interrogate that. And it's actually encouraged me to speak more on that. Not that this is like some great epidemic in the way that I think, it's a national crisis, but I do think it's one of these lurking things. The World Happiness Report is a report that's been coming out for many, many years, which ranks the happiest countries in the world down to the least
Mhm.
happy. And it's 130, 135, 37 countries year over year. So you have great longitudinal data. And the US has never been in the top 10. And in 2025, as you and I are recording this, the US for the first time is not even in the top 20.
Mm.
And that's despite having more things, more wealth, more everything that you would think would bring happiness. But we are increasingly living in the world that's more disconnected, it's more polarized, it's more anxious. just solving for things and not fulfillment. And so, yes, this is happening kind of, at a national level, but it's also happening in our own individual lives. Are you solving for truly the things that matter in your life? A relationship with your family, your health, your causes, the stuff that really brings fulfillment? Or are you solving for, I'm crushing it, I'm making a lot of
Yeah.
money? They're not mutually exclusive, but I will say that, what you're solving for is generally what you get. And the part of the thing that I find so exciting is making the things that we do for a living really ladder up to the life we want, and that's what I feel very strongly about.
And you're writing a book, The Happiness Reboot, The Path to Reclaiming Your Joy, which is everything we're talking about. And I can't
Yeah.
wait for that to come out because when I think of happiness, I have this question for you. Is happiness a choice or is
Yeah.
it a discipline, a lifestyle? How would you define it?
Yeah, D, all of the above. I love the choice. Happiness is a verb. Um, Mindset has a lot to do with how we experience the world around us. And expectations has a lot to do with how we experience the world. But ultimately, you make decisions every single day in terms of what you're solving for, what you're prioritizing, things that bring you joy or not. And part of what I offer in the book is a series of questions, almost Socratic in nature, to help people flesh out what are my sources of joy and happiness, and even more so fulfillment. I tell people that happiness can come from places and sources that are high fidelity and low fidelity, high quality and low quality, but it can also come from sources that are intrinsic and extrinsic. So high fidelity and intrinsic, that upper right hand quadrant is like purpose,
Hmm.
meaning, fulfillment, costs you nothing, meditation, like a sense of who you are, investing time in that. But it can also be high and extrinsic. You're a runner, you're someone who spends a lot of time outside, running with your daughter,
Hmm.
spending time with friends, spending time with family, going on a trip and having meaningful experiences. To talk about money that buys experiences is actually pretty well spent. And then, yes, you have happiness that comes from, extrinsic low fidelity sources, which are like, I could get drunk, I could do things that are fun, but there's not really going to be a lot of lifespan there. And so you want to make sure not too much of your happiness is coming from. But the whole point is, Greg, I want to encourage people just to be intentional with it, to organize their life around it, and to know that a lot of it is our choice. And it's not out of reach. It is very in reach. Last thing I would just say, in my book, I really interrogate three areas of our life that occupy a lot of real estate: your faith, your relationships, and your career. We spent a lot of this call so far talking about our career, the decisions you make relative to your career. Am I doing things that give me joy, that I'm excited about, that give me a lifestyle, or am I doing the things that look cool? The more you find work that fulfills you, the more likely you are to be fulfilled in life. In fact, the stat says, Greg, if I am doing work that is not fulfilling, I have a less than 1% chance of being fulfilled in life. Let me say that again. Unless you do work that is fulfilling, you have a less than 1% chance of being fulfilled in life. So I spend a lot of time arguing and advocating for why people should think about their careers as a place that needs to bring them fulfillment. Think about relationships, whether you get married, whether you have kids, the relationship with your parents, your sibling, all of those, particularly when there are scripts that tell you how you're supposed to live and how you're supposed to do things, maybe not necessarily aligned with your personal needs for happiness. Sometimes you can be in relationships that aren't fulfilling and draining because you're doing things out of duty or out of loyalty. And I say, let's challenge some of those. And then the last is faith. Faith has a really important role to play in people's happiness, but particularly when it's on your terms. So I spend a lot of time just saying, it's really, really difficult if you don't wrestle with the tough questions and decisions in each of these major aspects of life, because there's not a lot of life left after that if you really want to be happy.
Yeah, those are great points. I think the faith part is huge, and it's look, it's not for everybody. I get that, but I can just say from my own life, the more committed to my faith that I've become, the more I've invested in that, the more
Yeah.
I receive out of it, and it doesn't mean life is easy, but it helps navigate those paths, and you get fulfillment from that. There's a peace that comes with that. So, and I think that's different for everybody, but it's certainly something we talk about on this podcast. On the relationship front, I think that's a key point too, obviously with family and other things. But for men, there's plenty
Mm,
of studies about men that as we get older, we have fewer relationships. We tend
yeah.
to let those relationships wither, right, and not intentionally, but we just become distant from our friends. And if you invest in those friendships between men, and they're real friendships where you're talking about your problems, there's a lot of fulfillment and happiness, I believe, that comes from that.
Absolutely. In fact, Greg, there's a really popular set of Instagram reels that are going on that are basically synthesizing and summarizing this Harvard research study that was done on happiness. And they studied people over decades and decades, I think something like 70 or 80 years. I could be wrong, but in that time frame. And they looked for the most significant leading outcomes of longer life, and it wasn't exercise, it wasn't food and diet, it wasn't, money, it wasn't any of those things. It was the quality of the relationships in their life at 50 and beyond. And it's powerful when you think about your point. This is true for humans in general, that your relationships, the quality of your connections, strong tie relationships, feeling emotional safety, has a lot to do with whether or not you physiologically. Research shows that you're going to have less inflammation in your body.
Hmm.
You're going to be healthier if you're in community and connection. And to your point, when you think about how men are socialized, we're not necessarily socialized to really lean into being vulnerable and being connected to people in authentic ways. You can have people you hang out with, but are you vulnerable? Are you able to really benefit from nurturing connections? And oh, by the way, um, if I haven't been nurturing these relationships all along, it's kind of not impossible, but like you don't wake up at
Right.
65 and say, let me start having relationships with my kids and my family and my grandkids and I think these are, in order to have strong tie relationships, you're building and nurturing them over time. So to the degree that you have prioritized in our career discussion, all of the things, making money and status and accumulating things and not relationships, while you really are shortchanging your ability to have a long and healthy life. And, I talk about in my book, listen, I've had divorces, have had my own challenges, which gives you an opportunity to reflect and introspect over what were their key decisions that led me to want to be in a relationship or not to be in a relationship. And if I'm honest with myself, what can I learn to take into this next season of life that gives me more joy, more happiness, and being vulnerable about that, right? Not every relationship it has to, you know, be a bed of roses.
Hmm.
Sometimes there are relationships that come into your life for a season to help grow you and mature you and develop you and nudge you. And I've been really, really grateful to have those relationships, even some of the ones that were tough and were uncomfortable at time. They were ultimately for my good. And hopefully, the people in your life will look and say, "I'm so much better because Greg's in my life, or because Craig's in my life." And that's that would mean something. I say if I died today, I would love to feel like there was not anything that I wish I had done, someone that I wish I had said something positive to or poured into. Do that today. Do it every moment
Yeah.
you can. But relationships are important.
So one other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about identifying happiness and what makes us happy is wrestling with identity. I think we get caught up in
Mm,
worrying about how people perceive us, perhaps how we
yes.
perceive ourselves. I'm the
Yes.
CEO, I'm the corporate guy, I'm this. And if you divert off that, maybe you feel lesser than. Did you explore some of that in your studies about wrestling
Yeah.
with identity?
Yeah. Our ego is the biggest blocker to our happiness. Um, because there's this great book that I encourage all of your readers to your listeners to read it. called From Strength to Strength by
Yeah.
Arthur Brooks.
Yes.
Um, and, Arthur Brooks and many others, Rex Rubin, Dan Gilbert. There's so many, big giants in the space of happiness. Viktor Frankl going way back before him. But Arthur Brooks really nailed it. And he talks a lot about how our ego gets in the way of us embracing our next strength, because the ego that I have is the way in which I feel respected and honored, the way I make a living. And I'm unclear who I am if not these things. Who am I if not these things? And because I don't know who I am, or I'm not quite sure I like the look or the sound of that, or people are going to like, I miss out on the opportunity to embrace my next strength, my next season. And I'm still holding on to a melting ice cube of who I was, and missing out on the opportunity to move on to firm land. And so a big part of what, you asked about moving from these types of roles that I had and moving into a portfolio life, a portfolio career. What I didn't tell you, Greg, is that I had to overcome my ego.
Hmm.
Uh, I had been this golden child who had always been doing these things, and that's how I received love. That's how I received validation. That's how I felt seen. And to kind of step into a world where it wasn't super clear what you were doing, and you didn't have a clear title, you didn't have a lot of these kind of attributes, you didn't have LinkedIn likes about everything you did. Um, and I had to be okay with just like leaving that behind. I had to leave my ego. If an executive recruiter called me about a CEO opportunity, I had to say, is my ego answering this phone? Who's answering this phone?
Right.
Because if it's my ego, the conversation is not going to go well. I'm going to end up doing something that's not going to bring me joy and happiness. And I've had to, the ego never dies. Don't, you never get to this, kind of nirvana state. You have to kind of keep checking that. And there's some healthiness to having a sense of that. But by and large, the ego stands in the way of us and our happiness, because we spend too much time concerned with what people think. Will people love us? Will we be accepted by the tribe? Um, versus, will I be happy? Will I be fulfilled? Will I find a new tribe that really reflects and values what I value? And therefore, I experience greater levels of happiness.
Yeah. Seeking validation, right? We're always seeking validation, and that's part of that self identity. And I'm glad to hear you talk about that, because I do think that's a major hurdle for a lot of us. So if through all your studies here on happiness, and you're writing this book, is there something that surprised you the most in your research that made you scratch your head? One thing I think about is the fact that, there's studies that, there's a certain amount of happiness up to income $75,000 or 100,000, but after that, it's minimal, the amount of happiness that comes from that. So we're always thinking about, making more
Yeah.
money, would be more happy. What kind of things jumped out to you, perhaps, in your studies?
Yeah, I love all of the conventional wisdom of what will bring us happiness, and how the research just shows repeatedly that it doesn't. Yet these playbooks that we're given, and sometimes that we embrace knowingly, we just have a hard time letting go. The playbook that if I make more money, I'm going to be happier. If I can marry or partner with someone who looks a certain kind of way, that's going to bring me happiness. If I can accumulate these things, it'll make me. And the truth of the matter is, most of these things are kind of what they call a hedonic treadmill.
Hmm.
You're on it, you're running, you run faster and faster, faster, but you're actually not making progress. And and what I found, what was so interesting, is about some of the people who were happiest in the world and lived the longest and had all of these things, were people whose lives were quite simple, who had a really strong sense of community, connection, belonging, purpose. The ingredients were quite simple and quite accessible, except for if you had a brick wall called your ego or something else standing in between you and it. But it was really accessible. And the other thing I thought was really interesting, uh, as Homo sapiens, we are social animals, and there's certain about belonging to the tribe that's part of how we're hardwired. But it also makes it really difficult to not crowdsource your happiness. We generally kind of look to the crowd and say, what makes us happy? What are you, if I took a poll around, like, 1,000 people found this thing made them happy, then the assumption is that it will make me happy. And how idiosyncratic happiness really is, was also really a great insight. Like it is a very personal
Yeah.
thing. It's a very personal. If you're on social media and you're constantly being fed images of what you think, or what the AI algorithm thinks will make you happy, the hard time you're going to get there. It really requires you to go in. But the other thing I would just say, maybe the last, and this is my own personal, which is there's a need for just grace, because we are here in running these scripts and these playbooks not because we want to. We don't know anything else. We are constantly encouraged by society, our families, even people who love us, to run these scripts, because we don't know anything better. And so it's hard. It's hard to break off and do something different. It's hard to be right-handed and start writing with your left hand. Which is why I just encourage grace in the process. Start small, start with a little bit of curiosity where you have conviction, and just slowly but surely check in. When do I feel joy? When do I feel depleted? What things are bringing me joy? Which things are taking away my joy? And then look for small ways to organize your life around it. It might mean I'm going to stop checking my emails after 5 o'clock on Fridays, or it might mean that I'm going to say no to a conference call that I would normally say yes to because I want to spend time with my kids or go running in the morning. But whatever it is, just finding small incremental ways with grace to start incorporating more and more happiness. So yeah, I would just say, like, one, it's a lot simpler, a lot more accessible than we think. Two, it requires courage to not crowdsource. Three, it requires grace to give yourself the time to change some of these habits and to find small but incrementally, cumulative ways to like incorporate happiness in your life. And to be honest with you, I think that this is something we should all do, no matter who you are. This
Yeah.
should just be part of our how we exist.
Grace is such a good word. I mean, it's such a good thought. Grace for ourselves, grace for others. We get worked up about others too. I think that's a great point. So you're really touching on what was going to be my next question about what people can do, and you're touching on it because I don't think that the answer is go quit your job because you want to you know be a woodworker and you've never done that before, right? Don't go do that. But I do think you have to invest the time in scratching the surface, right? Figuring out what works for you, have that
Yep,
quiet time, right? You have to make the commitment to, maybe you're not going to watch that Netflix show and you're going to sit in your office and think about what do you want to do. So there's really the little things that can lead to the big things here.
that's right. That's absolutely right. You've got to create the space for it. We began this discussion talking about being intentional. It is a choice, and so you've got to be intentional in terms of creating the space for it. And part of what I love about the portfolio approach is you don't need one single thing to bet the farm on. You don't need to like quit your job and go bet the farm on this one thing. If that speaks to you and that's what you feel called to, then fine. But you don't have to. It doesn't have to be a road to Damascus moment where I'm expecting light to hit me and I fall off my horse and then I now know what I'm supposed to do. It probably is a series of experiments and checking in with yourself and being introspective and reflective, talking to the people who love you and asking them questions. Have you seen me light up? When do you see me happy? When do
Yeah.
you notice it? But a lot of what I think is particularly important in this day and age, in this society that we're living in, is what I call having curiosity over conviction. We are showing up, Greg, in so many conversations with others and even with ourselves with so much conviction. We have conviction about things where we actually should have curiosity. Instead of showing up thinking you know the answer, show up with questions, and some of the blind spots that we have around our ability to connect with other people and to build bridges, but to also find happiness in ourselves really starts with just being curious, asking the questions. A smart question is better than a smart answer any day. Um, so this is maybe another way of encouraging people who might be listening to this is to think about the areas of your life where you have lots of conviction, meaning like you're willing to run through a brick wall. You believe ride or die this thing. My family believe this thing. I believe this thing. This is what we believe. And I want you to ask yourself, why do you believe this? What evidence, what proof, what fact, what lived experiences do you have that reinforce that thing that you have conviction is worthy of your conviction? And ask yourself, well, how might I test that with curiosity? What questions might I ask? How might I just zoom out, open the aperture, and make sure that it's worthy of my conviction? And my sense is, doesn't matter what the answer is, the practice of doing that will probably lead to greater happiness, greater insight, and greater growth.
Yeah. And the key is to start, to do right, to start the project. And a lot of times we want to wait until we have it all figured out to make a pivot. Or I mean, this podcast is a good example, Craig. We talked about it a little bit before, but I've been thinking about doing this forever. I don't know where it's going to go, but I've been wanting to do it. And last year I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And I figured out how to start it. And I've had these great conversations with people, great conversations like this one that motivate me, that inspire me, and then hopefully inspire other people, right? And I get so much joy and happiness out of doing this, right? If nothing else than that. So, but I had to start, right? I had
Sure.
to just start doing it. And I just give that as an example to people, whatever your thing might be, just get started. Just figure it out
Yeah.
along the way and just start carve out that time to do whatever that thing is that there's something in your head that you're thinking about right now if you're listening to this that you want to do. Just go
Yep.
start nibbling away on it, right?
Greg, one of the things I love about what you're doing is you didn't say, "Hey, I need to be Joe Rogan," and I'm going to define you. That's not what you said. You said, "Hey, this is something I'm curious about. This is something I feel led to do. I'm not exactly sure where it's going to go, but it's bringing me joy, and it seems to align with a purpose that I have not yet addressed." And that in of itself is powerful. The other thing you're doing, Greg, is you are creating safe space for people to have conversations about things that are important and relevant, but also vulnerable. We live in a time that perhaps maybe my great grandfather might have recognized in this country, the level of polarization, level of vitriol, the level of angst, the level of tribalism that's happening right now. Um, because we as humans aren't talking to each other. We're not meeting each other around the shared, kind of fears, aspirations, anxiety of just being humans. And then the conversation that I believe you're having, Greg, is modeling the way we should be talking to each other all the time.
Hmm.
And if we were showing up with more curiosity about each other versus conviction, my sense is we turn down the volume a little bit, we turn up the pace a little bit, um, and everyone would experience a little bit more happiness. And I'm not to say that makes differences go away, but I think our ability to work through differences and to resolve them significantly higher when you show up with an open heart, an openness, a curiosity about someone. You've asked a lot of questions, and I look forward to hearing how you would answer these questions because I'm just as curious about you, Greg. But what you're doing on the show is modeling the type of behavior that I think more of us should be doing in our street corners, in our barbershops, in our places of worship, in our workplaces. So
Well, I
thank you for that.
appreciate it, and I appreciate the lessons you have to teach people. The book uh, is in the works. When are we going to be bringing that baby out? When can people look for it?
The manuscript right here, Greg. This is
Beautiful.
yes, it should be coming out early part of next year. So I'll make sure I let you know so we can
Yeah.
let your audience know.
Yeah, I'd love to chat with you about it again. And I knew this was going to be a great conversation, Craig, and it exceeded my expectations. So it's so good to reconnect with you and hear your message. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing because there's a need for it, and I think people will learn a lot from it. So appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you, Greg, for having me and look forward to coming back again.
All right, have a good one.